We live in a paradoxical era, where the ambition for total control coexists with the growing evidence of its futility. Governments, corporations, and even social movements aspire to orchestrate realities, to shape collective destinies through grandiose plans and massive interventions. The dominant narrative celebrates the power of organized human will, the ability to predict, direct, and optimize complex systems from a central command. We applaud social engineering, macroeconomic management, and meticulous regulation, as if they were unequivocal manifestations of progress and rationality. However, beneath the surface of this almost religious confidence in planning, lies an ancient disquiet, a suspicion that something fundamental escapes these schemes. Could it be that the very scale and complexity of the systems we try to dominate contain the seeds of their own failure? Are we, in our pursuit of imposed order, ignoring a more resilient and adaptive form of organization that emerges spontaneously from individual interactions? The figure of Friedrich August von Hayek, Nobel laureate economist and philosopher, stands as a challenging beacon in this fog of certainties. His work, often misunderstood or caricatured, offers a devastating critique of the fatal conceit of rationalist constructivism, the belief that we can design and control society as an engineer designs a machine. Hayek was neither a naive anarchist nor a blind defender of laissez-faire. His central concern lay in the nature and limits of human knowledge in social contexts. He argued, with an almost obsessive persistence, that the information necessary to effectively coordinate a modern economy or any complex social system does not exist in a concentrated form in any single mind or central committee. Rather, it is irremediably dispersed, fragmented, often tacit and contextual, residing in the experiences, expectations, and local adaptations of millions of individuals. To attempt to replace this decentralized process of discovery and adjustment, what he called spontaneous order, catalyzed by the price system in a market economy, with a central plan would be not only inefficient but fundamentally impossible. It would inevitably lead to the misallocation of resources, stagnation, loss of freedom, and, ultimately, the collapse of the very order it intended to create. This introduction does not seek merely to revisit Hayek, but rather to use his analytical framework as a lens to dissect the inherent fragility of giant states, not only nations, but any excessively centralized power structures that attempt to micromanage complexity. We will question, what is the true secret behind their chronic instability? Is it corruption, incompetence, ideology, or is it something deeper, an intrinsic epistemic flaw, a fundamental inability to deal with the reality of dispersed information? As Hayek postulated, we will explore how this impossibility of economic calculation in centralized systems manifests itself not only in the economy, but in various spheres of social and political life, undermining resilience and adaptability. We will challenge the notion that more control is always the answer, suggesting that true wisdom may lie in cultivating the conditions for self-organized orders to flourish. Prepare for a journey that dismantles myths and reveals the hidden dynamics that doom projects of total control, paving the way for a more humble and, perhaps, more effective understanding of how prosperity and freedom can coexist in an inescapably complex world. Hayek's intellectual roots lie deep in the fertile but turbulent soil of early 20th century Vienna, an intellectual melting pot where debates about socialism, liberalism, and the future of the economic order were seething. Having witnessed the devastating hyperinflation in post-World War I Austria and, later, the horrors of totalitarianism in Germany and Soviet Russia, Hayek developed an acute sensitivity to the dangers inherent in the concentration of power and the attempt to subordinate economic and social life to a central plan. His initial training under the tutelage of Ludwig von Mises, another giant of the Austrian school of economics, was crucial. It was Mises who first articulated in a compelling way the problem of socialist economic calculation in his seminal 1920 essay, arguing that, in the absence of private ownership of the means of production and, consequently, of a genuine price system that reflected the relative scarcity of capital goods, a central planning authority would be incapable of making rational decisions about how to allocate resources. Without market prices for the factors of production, there would be no way to compare the cost of different production methods or determine which final goods were most urgently desired by consumers. Central planning, Mises concluded, would not only be inefficient but would lead to planned chaos. Hayek, initially attracted to moderate socialist ideas in his youth, was deeply impacted by Mises's argument. However, he took the critique a step further, shifting the main focus from the absence of prices to an even more fundamental problem: the dispersed and tacit nature of the knowledge relevant to economic coordination. In his most famous essay, The Use of Knowledge in Society, 1945, Hayek argued that the central challenge of any economic system is not merely to allocate given resources, as if all the necessary information were available to an omniscient planner, but rather how to ensure the best use of knowledge that, in its totality, is given to no one. This knowledge includes not only scientific or technical data but also, and crucially, the knowledge of the particular circumstances of time and place. Information about local needs, fleeting opportunities, specific capabilities, and contextual adaptations that only the individuals directly involved possess. No central planner, no matter how well-intentioned or computationally powerful, could aggregate and process this vast, dynamic, and often inarticulate mass of information. The price system, in this context, is seen not merely as an allocation mechanism but as an extraordinarily efficient communication system, a means of transmitting summarized and relevant information about relative scarcity and preferences, allowing millions of agents, each with their limited knowledge, to coordinate their actions in a decentralized and largely unconscious way, as if guided by an invisible hand. This evolution of the argument, from the impossibility of calculation, Mises, to the irreducible dispersion of knowledge, Hayek, marked a crucial turning point, providing a more robust epistemic basis for the critique of central planning and the defense of spontaneous orders. The market order, for Hayek, is not a product of deliberate design but an example of spontaneous order, or cosmos, similar to language or common law, which emerges organically from the interactions of individuals who follow certain general rules of conduct, such as respect for property and contracts, without anyone needing to understand or control the resulting general pattern. In contrast, attempts to impose a made order or taxis, like an army or a bureaucracy, through specific commands, are bound to be limited in their complexity and adaptability, precisely because they depend on the limited knowledge of the planners. This distinction between cosmos and taxis became central in his later work, especially in Law, Legislation, and Liberty, where he applied this analysis not only to economics, but also to legal and political systems, arguing that individual liberty flourishes best under a regime of general and abstract laws that allow for the formation of spontaneous orders, rather than discretionary legislation that attempts to direct specific outcomes. Hayek's intellectual trajectory, therefore, represents a progressive journey of deepening understanding of the limits of human knowledge and the potentialities of social self-organization, a journey that took him from a technical critique of socialism to a comprehensive social philosophy that challenges the foundations of the constructivist rationalism that dominated, and still dominates, much of modern thought about governance and social organization. One of the most insidious and powerful aspects that sustain the persistence of centralized systems, despite their recurring failures, is the way they disguise themselves as natural or inevitable. This camouflage operates on multiple levels, from deeply rooted cultural assumptions to the very language we use to describe the social order. We tend to anthropomorphize society, to imagine it as a unified organism, with a single will or a collective purpose that needs to be articulated and implemented by a central authority. The very idea of government as a directing brain, responsible for guiding the social body, is so ingrained in our thinking that questioning it seems almost absurd. This organicist metaphor, although useful in certain contexts, obscures the reality that society is composed of millions of individuals with their own plans, knowledge, and values, and that social order emerges not from a central command, but from the complex web of interactions among them. Centralization, in this mental framework, appears as the logical and mature form of organization, while decentralization and spontaneity are often seen as chaotic, primitive, or insufficient to deal with modern challenges. Consider language. We speak of managing the economy, governing society, controlling inflation, as if they were tasks analogous to piloting an airplane or operating a machine. This terminology reinforces the illusion of control and predictability, ignoring the fundamentally uncertain and uncoordinated nature of the social process. The very existence of vast state bureaucracies, with their complex organizational charts 5-year plans, and batteries of indicators, creates an aura of competence and necessity. The visibility of the centralized structure contrasts with the relative invisibility of market processes and spontaneous orders. It is easy to point to the ministry or regulatory agency as the cause of a particular outcome, whether good or bad, while the decentralized coordination operated by the price system or social norms is much more difficult to visualize and attribute. This asymmetry of visibility leads to a cognitive bias in favor of intervention and planning. When something goes wrong, the instinctive reaction is to clamor for more regulation, more central control, instead of questioning whether the very attempt at control was the cause of the problem or whether more effective decentralized mechanisms are being suppressed. Furthermore, centralization often presents itself as the only solution to complex problems that require collective action, such as environmental protection, public safety, or the reduction of inequality. It is argued that only a centralized power has the authority, resources, and long-term vision necessary to face these challenges. Although coordination is indeed necessary, this narrative conveniently ignores or minimizes the possibility of decentralized solutions, whether based on well-defined property rights, as in the case of the management of common resources by local communities, studied by Eleanor Ostrom, on market mechanisms, such as carbon emissions markets, or on voluntary initiatives of civil society. Centralization is sold as the only viable route, becoming a self-fulfilling prophecy. By suppressing or hindering decentralized alternatives, it reinforces the perception of its own indispensability. This naturalization of centralization is further cemented by vested interests. Bureaucrats, politicians, and interest groups that benefit from the status quo have a strong incentive to perpetuate the belief in the necessity and effectiveness of central control. They shape the public narrative, finance studies that prove the need for their interventions, and resist reforms that could diminish their power or their relevance. The complexity of regulations and centralized decision-making processes also creates barriers to entry for alternative solutions and hinders public scrutiny, reinforcing the appearance that experts at the center know what is best. Therefore, the disguise of centralization as natural or inevitable is not a mere cognitive accident but a multifaceted phenomenon, sustained by cultural metaphors, linguistic biases, asymmetries of visibility, and powerful interests. Unmasking this illusion is a crucial step toward recognizing the validity and potential of spontaneous orders and questioning the fatal arrogance that animates so many projects of social engineering. It is about realizing that the absence of a visible central planner does not mean the absence of order, but rather the presence of a different order, more complex, adaptive, and, ultimately, more aligned with the dispersed nature of human knowledge. The tension between the order imposed by centralization and individual and collective autonomy is one of the most critical and recurring themes in Hayekian analysis. For Hayek, individual liberty is not only a desirable moral value in itself but an essential, functional condition for the prosperity and progress of a complex society. It is precisely because relevant knowledge is dispersed and often tacit that individuals need the freedom to use their own information and skills in the pursuit of their own goals. When a central power tries to dictate the ends and the means, it not only violates the dignity of the individual but also wastes society's most valuable resource, distributed knowledge. Individual autonomy, in this sense, is the key to the process of discovery that drives adaptation and innovation. Each person, by acting based on their local knowledge and expectations, contributes to a vast social experiment, testing hypotheses, finding niches, signaling needs, and revealing possibilities that no central planner could anticipate. The price system, as we have seen, acts as a mechanism for aggregating and transmitting this dispersed information, allowing coordination without central coercion. The attempt to replace this spontaneous coordination with a deliberate plan inevitably restricts the scope of individual action. The rules become more specific and prescriptive, rather than general and abstract. Decisions about what to produce, how to produce, where to work, what to consume are progressively transferred from the individual to the central authority. Even if this transfer is made in the name of the common good or efficiency, the net result is a reduction in the space where the individual can exercise their judgment and responsibility. This erosion of autonomy is not only a matter of personal freedom but has profound systemic consequences. By limiting the ability of individuals to experiment and adapt, centralization stifles innovation and the responsiveness of society to change. It makes the system more rigid, more fragile, and less able to cope with the unexpected. The diversity of individual plans and actions, which is the source of resilience in a spontaneous order, is replaced by the uniformity imposed by the central plan. Furthermore, the concentration of decision-making power at the center creates psychological and material dependence. Individuals lose the habit of taking initiative, of solving problems locally, of taking risks. Responsibility is externalized to the state or the central authority. This can lead to a culture of passivity, entitlement, and rent-seeking, rather than a culture of entrepreneurship, voluntary cooperation, and mutual responsibility. Collective autonomy is also affected, although centralization may seem like a way to exercise the collective will. In practice, it often means the imposition of the will of a minority, the planners, the politicians, the bureaucrats, on the majority. Decisions made at the center rarely reflect the diversity of preferences and values existing in society. Local groups, communities, and voluntary associations lose the ability to self-govern and find solutions adapted to their specific circumstances. Subsidiarity, the principle that decisions should be taken at the lowest possible level, is violated, leading to standardized and inadequate solutions. A generic illustrative example can be found in excessively centralized urban planning systems. When a central authority rigidly dictates land uses, building patterns, and infrastructure for an entire city, it ignores the local knowledge of residents about their neighborhood needs, actual traffic flows, small business opportunities, or the specific social dynamics of each district. The result is often dysfunctional urban projects, lifeless neighborhoods, unexpected congestion, and an inability to adapt the built environment to changing needs and technologies. In contrast, cities that allow greater local flexibility and experimentation, where the rules are more general and allow for the emergence of bottom-up solutions, tend to be more vibrant, resilient, and adapted to the needs of their inhabitants. The autonomy of individuals and local communities to shape their own environment, within a framework of general rules, generates a richer and more functional urban order than any master plan imposed from above. Thus, the impact of centralization on individual and collective autonomy is profound and multifaceted. By restricting the freedom to use dispersed knowledge, it not only limits the sphere of personal action but also impairs the adaptive capacity and vitality of society itself. The Hayekian defense of liberty, therefore, is not merely a moral appeal but a pragmatic argument about the necessary conditions for complex societies to flourish. Dismantling the pernicious effects of excessive centralization and cultivating the conditions for more resilient spontaneous orders is not a simple task, as it requires a fundamental change of perspective and overcoming deeply ingrained resistance. It is not about abolishing every form of central authority or planning. Hayek recognized the need for a stable legal and institutional framework provided by the state, but about redefining the appropriate role of that authority and unleashing the creative potential of decentralized interactions. A central strategy lies in promoting the principle of subsidiarity, that is, devolving decision-making power to the most local levels possible, where relevant knowledge is more abundant and the consequences of decisions are more directly felt. This implies not only administrative decentralization but also the creation of spaces for the genuine autonomy of local communities, voluntary associations, and individuals in the management of their own affairs, from education and security to urban planning and natural resource management, strengthening intermediate institutions, families, communities, churches, clubs, businesses, that mediate between the individual and the state is crucial to creating a rich and self-organized social fabric, capable of solving problems without constantly resorting to central intervention. Another fundamental strategy is the reform of the legal system itself, moving away from discretionary and detailed legislation that attempts to micromanage outcomes, and moving closer to an ideal of the rule of law, in the Hayekian sense, a system of general, abstract rules, known and applied equally to all, including the government itself. These rules should clearly define property rights, contractual obligations, and liability for damages, creating a stable and predictable framework within which individuals can pursue their own plans and coordinate their actions peacefully and productively. The goal is not to dictate what people should do but to establish the rules of the game that allow for the emergence of a beneficial order. This requires a restraint on legislative and regulatory power, resisting the temptation to intervene in every perceived problem with new laws and decrees that often generate unintended consequences and distort market signals. Transparency and regulatory simplification are essential to reduce the artificial complexity that favors special interests and stifles individual initiative. In the economic field, the strategy involves freeing the price system so that it can fulfill its function of communication and coordination. This implies reducing barriers to entry in markets, eliminating subsidies and privileges that distort competition, ensuring a stable currency, a crucial point for Hayek, who saw inflation as one of the most destructive forms of government intervention, and allowing profits and losses to signal the success or failure of entrepreneurial initiatives. It is about trusting more in the market discovery process, even if its results do not always correspond to the preferences of planners or preconceived notions of social justice. Education plays a vital role in this dismantling. It is necessary to disseminate a deeper understanding of the nature of spontaneous orders, the limits of human knowledge, and the dangers of constructivist arrogance. Teaching economics not as a set of equations and interventions, but as a study of how individuals, with their diverse knowledge and motivations, interact to create wealth and social order, is essential. Similarly, a broader education in history, philosophy, and social sciences can help to cultivate a more critical and reflective attitude towards claims of central planning and the promises of technocratic control. Finally, and perhaps most importantly, this transformation requires a shift in the prevailing cultural narrative. We need to move away from the idea that society is a machine to be engineered and embrace a vision of society as a complex adaptive system, constantly evolving and learning. This means recognizing the value of diversity, experimentation, and bottom-up solutions. It implies cultivating a greater humility in the face of the unknown and a greater trust in the capacity of free individuals to find their own way. It means fostering a culture of responsibility and cooperation, where individuals see themselves not as passive recipients of benefits or victims of circumstances, but as active agents in shaping their own lives and communities. This is not a call for a utopian or naive return to a pre-modern state of nature. Hayek was not an anarchist, and he recognized the legitimate functions of government in providing a framework of law and order, enforcing contracts, and providing certain public goods. Rather, it is a call for a more nuanced and sophisticated understanding of the relationship between the individual and the state, between freedom and order. It is a call for a society that, while protecting individual rights and ensuring a basic level of security and justice, also allows the greatest possible space for the free play of individual initiative and the spontaneous emergence of solutions. The third step is to unleash the potential of spontaneous orders, removing obstacles to competition, allowing prices to function as signals, and promoting subsidiarity, devolving decision-making power to the most local levels possible. It is about cultivating ecosystems where voluntary cooperation, entrepreneurship, and bottom-up problem-solving can flourish. This does not mean a minimal or absent state, but a state focused on its essential functions of ensuring peace, justice, and a stable framework for social interaction, rather than trying to direct and control every aspect of life. Adopting this transformative perspective requires intellectual courage to question established dogmas and political will to resist the sirens of centralization and control. It is a path that recognizes the irreducible complexity of the world and trusts in the capacity of free and responsible individuals to find innovative and adaptive solutions to the challenges they face. By revealing the hidden mechanisms that undermine projects of total control, Hayek does not offer us despair but a hope grounded in a deeper understanding of how freedom and prosperity can emerge, not despite our ignorance, but precisely because of it, through the decentralized magic of spontaneous order. The true art of governing, perhaps, is not that of commanding, but that of cultivating the conditions for self-organization to flourish.